What romantic images do the words Spanish privateer conjure up? Many Floridians would be surprised to learn that swashbuckling adventure on the high seas was just part of the 2 centuries when our state was a colony of Spain. In August 2004, I talked to 2 historians who shed light on a little-known chapter in Florida's history.
I think I once calculated out how many years there were of warfare in the 18th century and how many years there were of peace, and I think it was a 40-60 split, that there were about 40 years of war and 60 years of peace.
Jim Cusick is curator of the P.K. Young Library of Florida History in Gainesville.
More often than not, the European nations and their colonies were at war at this time. In a sense, those conflicts kind of shaped all of American history.
The last years of what historians now call Florida's first Spanish period, from 1565 to 1763, were turbulent ones for Europe and the New World. It was a time of war and shifting alliances as European nations all tried to enrich themselves at the expense of their rivals.
Today, economists are always talking about creating wealth. Back then, in the 18th century, they basically thought that the wealth of the world, certainly the wealth in Europe, was essentially fixed, and that what different nation-states were doing was they were trying to enlarge their share of a fixed amount of wealth.
Carl Swanson is Associate Professor of History at East Carolina University.
If England or France or Spain were going to become richer and therefore more powerful, the only way they could really add to their wealth was by finding and establishing colonies and commerce outside of Europe.
The city of St. Augustine was the first successful colony in North America. By the 1700s, the city and its fort were seen as the last stronghold against encroaching British colonies in Georgia and the Carolinas. But Spain's attention was elsewhere.
The most important colonies from the perspective of Spain were the colonies that produced the silver, and those were Mexico and Peru. St. Augustine was on the fringe. It was as far north as the Spanish had gone, and it was really a frontier outpost. It had an important garrison, but it was the northern fringe of the Spanish Empire.
Spanish authorities were often late in supplying much-needed provisions. Other necessities like tools and farm implements could take years to arrive. In desperation, St. Augustine began trading secretly with the English colonies to the north. British ships brought food and manufactured goods and took home oranges, fish, even sea turtles.
The British colonies also found markets. They made money. This is especially true of Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. But there were also vessels from New York that would sail down to St. Augustine.
There was a great deal of animosity between British colonists and Spanish colonists along the Atlantic seaboard at this time. But despite that, there was this apparently irresistible urge to engage in trade. Trade between the British and Spanish ports seems to have gone on pretty much continuously. It's funny how quickly that would change the minute tensions rose and there was a declaration of war.
When wars broke out, first in 1739 and later in 1755, British goods were cut off. Rather than go without, the colonies turned to the long-established practice of privateering.
What a privateer is, it's a warship that is owned privately. During time of war, the monarchs of Europe would issue licenses, they called these letters of marque, to the owners of private vessels. And with the possession of a letter of marque, a private warship could go out and capture the commerce of an enemy.
Typically, when you got a letter of marque, it would say something along the lines of, you are to harass the enemy and do all possible damage within your power, and you have permission to sink or capture vessels flying the enemy flag. The thing that distinguished a privateer from a pirate was that a privateer then would have to take the ship into a friendly port and have it condemned before an admiralty court. And the privateer, the captain and crew and owners, would share in whatever the value of the ship was.
During war years, these Spanish privateers became the bane of British commerce on the high seas. The ships were often schooners with small crews and captains who fit the swashbuckling stereotype.
Florida was probably a pretty good base of operations. They were fast ships, were very maneuverable. They could usually outmaneuver a square-rigged ship. They could sail in shallower water, so they could duck into inlets. They could duck into rivers if they had to. They weren't under orders from any particular administration. They weren't given a particular mission. They were cruisers, basically. They could cruise where they wanted to.
Jim Cusick says privateer crews would seldom kill anyone, fearing consequences if they themselves were captured by the other side.
They would take them prisoner, essentially, and of course, if they were at all valuable prisoners, they would probably try and ransom them. And generally speaking, passengers, non-combatants on the ships were supposed to be safe in their personal property, not their cargoes.
But it's more than just privateering. It's how these Europeans and then their North American, their American colonists, how they looked at the world and how they competed with each other. They competed economically, and they especially competed militarily, and they saw that as sort of two sides of the same coin.
Florida's privateers and the illicit trade between colonies is part of the unusual story told by Joyce Elizabeth Harmon in the book Trade and Privateering in Spanish Florida. Originally published in 1969, it's now been reissued by the University of Alabama Press. I'm Bill Dudley. With funding from the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, this report was produced by the Florida Humanities Council. Visit us on the web at flahum.org.